the course of the years, 40 years in ministry, I've had the opportunity to speak at a lot of different churches, a lot of different locations, both in churches that I've served in as well as in other churches as well. And many of you have been to lots of different types of churches and lots of different decor and size. Some very traditional, with beautiful stained glass windows and very formal, traditional from the European culture, and many like that kind of decor, and that becomes rather fascinating. And some I've been in a few times, very high order with a high lectern, and you're way up high in the pulpit area, isolated from the people, and it presents that kind of an image, but common in Europe from our ancestors. So I've been in those kinds of churches, and been in others that are very, very ornate, very, very large. The first church where I came to the Lord and served for 5 years in New Jersey, it was a congregation largely of German Baptist immigrants. They formed the church in Newark, New Jersey, and when they built this large building in Springfield, New Jersey, very, very ornate, very, very beautiful, a tremendous amount of money put into that building. They had the unusual stone walls imported from Europe, and it was remarkable. One of the men was a wealthy doctor, and he himself bought this spectacular pipe organ with all the pipes back there. You felt like you had to be in a tuxedo when you were in that church from week to week. Gorgeous. And I'm sure you've been in churches like that, contemporary, but very ornate, very beautiful. Some very plain and simplistic. The church that I pastored on Long Island, my first senior pastorate, was that kind of a church. It was nice, it was usable, but plain. When they built the building, there wasn't an enormous amount of money, so they built a structure to be functional, not necessarily ornate. And it was a nice building. The sanctuary area had glass windows on one side. You could be totally bored and look out on the 7-acre field that we had and just kind of gaze out there. And half the time, I think that's what they were doing. But they had the nice glass windows, and it was interesting because the back of this sanctuary, instead of having doors with walls, it was all glass to be able to look out into the foyer area. When they designed it, they did so for the sake of families with young children, where the children may be in the nursery in the back, may have had difficulties, and mom or dad may have had to get the kids, and they have to kind of quiet them down. It was a way to try to say to the congregation, hey, your kids are important to us. We don't want to lock you out. We realize you can't bring the kids back into the sanctuary and disturb, but at least you can be out in the foyer area and see and hear what's going on. So it was a way of saying you're welcome here, and so they did it with design. And I can remember in that church setting, maybe speaking, and I have some wise guys, teenagers in the church that were kind of cute and fun. Some of them might be helping in one of the kids' churches, and they'll come up into the foyer area to the glass and look in and, make the faces and stuff to me, and it make me laugh, get off track, just having fun time. But you had that kind of a structure, and lots of different types of structure and scenery, and looking out on the congregation, a lot of different ways that even the congregation is seated. Some there are chairs, less formal, multi-purpose buildings that we've been in. I've spoken in those kinds of facilities, as well as gymnasiums and retreat centers, and in the jungle, literally with no walls, just maybe a thatched roof or a grass roof over your head, with pigs and chickens running, back and forth in between, doing what they do, squealing and making all kinds of noise, and little kids running around with no clothes on, sometimes doing what they do, right there. And it's like another world out in the jungle, literally. And so I've been in those kinds of environments also, and they present their own fascinating little obstacles along the way. I've been in churches, we mentioned some that have chairs, some that have pews, set up different ways. Some, like our church on Long Island, was designed, it was kind of narrow and long. I always struggle with that. I like connection with people, so I hate the sense of people being a long distance from me. When we built the church that's not as deep but as wide, wraps around, and the connectedness is there. Some that have platforms, it was a waste for me because I never used it. I was always on the floor. Used to drive them crazy. They'd set everything up, pulpits there. I always ignored that stuff. I always like to be on the floor, same level with the people, connecting and having fun, and it's just a different style. So you have all those kinds of churches, but the one One moment, one experience that I had that was a tremendous privilege that made the deepest impression on me was the first time that I was asked to speak into a Bible conference for a week at the Stony Brook School on Long Island. You may have heard of it. It's a private school, Christian school, that has students from really all over the world that come live on campus. There are a lot of local students as well. Stony Brook School was a place of Bible conferences back in the 40s, 50s. Some of the big names of Christianity were there speaking. They used to have summer Bible conferences all the time. I was invited to do a series of meetings for a week that was for their students. It was their spiritual emphasis week. And I did a week worth of chapels plus a finale on Friday night where people from the community, the kids' families were in during that time to visit. And so the chapel was completely full all week long. It was an extraordinary opportunity. There were some faculty from Stony Brook School that were worshiping with us and a part of our church family, so that was the connection. And I was really privileged to be invited to speak during the conference that week. The first time I went in there, I'd never been on the chapel before, been on campus before. When I went in and they have a pipe organ that's playing, and it was really, it's quite an impressive scene with all the people that were there. And they had me come up and sit on the platform. When I did, just looking out, gazing, seeing who I would recognize, who I would know, what struck my attention was at the back, there was a balcony with a slight wall under the balcony. And there along the back wall was this slogan from this passage. And it's simply quoted from the King James Bible, the words that are right here that we read in our bulletin, the last words of John chapter 12, verse 21. It simply said, "Sir, we would see Jesus." I remember when I sat down, that's what grabbed my attention. And immediately, my body kind of had like the chills go through it. And that statement just exploded in my heart, and thought, that would be the passion and desire of anyone proclaiming the Word of God, that people who were there gathered would have a passionate desire to be able to see Jesus, to connect with him, to know him. And I just paused, a little bit of nervousness in that kind of a setting. It was not a familiar territory. It was a very significant event. And it was a moment where God just quietly spoke to me, quieted my own heart. And God said to me, that's what you need to be doing right now. You need to be focusing on who Jesus is. You need to be seeing who he is. And together we'll bring people into that connectiveness with who the Lord is. Over the years, that would be the longing of anybody in that kind of a position, the desire that those that we would share with and preach would have that hunger, that passion. We really want to see Jesus. We want to know who he is, and we want to connect to him. But realistically, that's not often the case. Let's be real. We come to church week after week with a lot of different stuff going on in our lives, a lot of different stuff going on in our minds, and some weeks maybe spiritually more connected than others, and maybe some weeks more tuned in than others, and maybe some weeks not tuned in at all. We're just kind of bodily there, but mind not really there, thinking in every which direction, what's going to happen in the day, what just happened that morning, how many fights we had before we got there, what happened during the week, what we're going to face the next day. All kinds of stuff, right? Fills the mind. And a lot of it disconnects us from what really should be the driving force of why we're gathering. I mean, be honest with yourself as I'm honest with myself. How many times have we come together, even us, on a Sunday morning and walking in your heart of hearts as you've gotten up that morning and prepared yourself that day, how many of you walked in saying to yourself, more than anything else, I am so passionate about wanting to lay hold of Jesus today? How many times has that happened? Well, when I saw that banner across the back wall, that's what grabbed my attention. I think about the ministry of Jesus over the course of his years. And just as we see in our culture that may not be the primary desire of a lot of people, that's kind of what he faced for much of the time. Even the Prince of Preachers, there weren't a lot of people who were interested in seeing him. Most of his preaching was marked by those who had deaf ears. Most of his preaching was marked by those who had little understanding, if any, rarely came to faith. Even his own disciples failed to get it. And here he is, the Son of God, God in their midst, declaring eternal truth. And for the masses, it was like, okay, do another trick for me, would you? Stop talking. Yapping's boring. I want to see another miracle. Wave the magic wand, rub the genie, whatever you got to do. Pull something out of your sleeve. Do something for me. That's the way it was for him. Yet, from a human perspective, as Jesus came into Jerusalem, one would have gotten the impression that maybe things were going to begin to change a little bit. I mean, the disciples had been with Jesus over 3 years and had seen all kinds of responses. Sometimes good, sometimes bad, sometimes in between. A lot of times they didn't get it. They're looking at each other saying, huh? What? Don't get it. What did he say? Did you hear that? I don't understand it. What do you mean by that? They don't even get it. Let alone the masses that Jesus taught over and over again over 3 years, not hearing, not getting it, over the head. But something's different, at least from this horizontal perspective from the disciples, because as Jesus entered Jerusalem, the events that preceded it seemed to set an interesting stage. The last great miracle that Jesus performed happened just a matter of a day or two, maybe several days, before his grand entrance. It took place a few miles outside of Jerusalem in the little village of Bethany. It was, of all of Jesus' miracles, the 35 that are recorded in the Gospels, clearly the greatest of all from a human vantage point. Anybody know which miracle we're referring to? Only John records it in John chapter 11. Of all of his healing miracles, this one was most astonishing. In a small village, a dear friend, family, Lazarus, is dead. Family's a bit ticked because he didn't show up in time to heal him. And so there's some rough communication going on with family, really agitated with him. And you remember that moment as he stood there and commanded them to roll away the stone, and in a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And there, bound up, he walks out from the tomb alive, and he says, just unwrap him. Well, John tells us, having been there, the reaction to that miracle leading up to Palm Sunday was pretty dramatic. Go back with me to John chapter 12 and verse 16, just to get the context and flow a little bit. Here is the great miracle in Bethany. Now Jesus comes to Jerusalem. And what a strange entrance it was, remember? He didn't come with an army, didn't come as a king, didn't come wearing a battle fatigue, didn't come with weapons. He takes a borrowed donkey, a beast of burden, comes in humility. The people are still thinking king until they see him, and they're trying to make sense of it all. But still there are the hosannas, right? All the praise. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. This is our Messiah. It sounded pretty good, but a little confusing by the look. And here he comes into Jerusalem. Look at verse 16 of John chapter 12. These things his disciples did not understand at first. This is John's commentary after the fact, putting all this together. He's saying, we didn't have a clue what was going on here. We're thinking kingship. He's coming in on a borrowed donkey. No chariot. No army. No spears. No swords. No battle going. This is weird. His disciples didn't get it at first. But when Jesus was glorified after the ascension, then they remembered these things were written of him and that they had done these things to him, the response and rejection. But verse 17, look at the thinking of the crowd. The multitude who were with Jesus when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead, they were bearing him witness, meaning what? What were they doing? They were telling everybody, you heard about this guy? We were there. You wouldn't believe what he pulled off in Bethany. I mean, you think you saw blind people see and lame people walk and lepers heal? You think that was big stuff? Yeah, you missed the big one. Small village. You missed the grand finale. Whoa, dead guy walked out of a tomb, man, and took off the wrappings. He was alive as alive could be. Didn't even stink. I mean, he is alive, as in alive, and they're just telling everybody about it. They're amazed. So his reputation is really starting to spread. Raising people from the dead. Nah, get out of here. All these people saw it. Wasn't some lone kook. Wasn't a couple of drunks. I mean, this is a large number of people who are telling a large number of people who are telling others in a large, and it's just spreading all over the place. The multitude who were with him when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead, they were bearing him witness. They were declaring that miracle of Jesus. Verse 18 says, for this cause also the multitude went and met him. There's an interesting clue. This is the reason why in Jerusalem hundreds and thousands of people began to gather in the streets when they heard that the Jesus who raised a guy from the dead, who had already been performing all of these miracles before this is the reason why they're gathering. If he can raise people from the dead, what can he do for our nation? He can raise us from the dead. If he can raise a guy from the dead, he can strike the Roman soldiers dead. He can go one way, he can go the other. They think they had it. This was it. And they're lining up. Can you imagine the large crowds? I think I mentioned it about 5-6 years ago. First and only time we went to New York City for the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. It was Linda's brother's idea because somebody in his church had a condo down near City Hall, the old World Trade Center site. And she gave it to us for that time. And we went in the Wednesday evening and went to the condo. What a place that was. And we stayed there overnight. Early the next morning, took the subway uptown. And it was the Thanksgiving about 5 or 6 years ago where it was 70 degrees. And then it was bizarre warm. And we just took our coats off and kind of had it wrapped around us. But the crowd was nuts. It was insane. And we were, a couple of blocks away. You can't get near Macy's. You have to have special tickets, and nobody gets there except for the people who are allowed. We were a few blocks away, wrapped around a corner, where we could see about 100 yards away where the parade and floats would be coming from. But it was a mess. I mean, you felt like a herd of cattle, just being pressed together. And it was super uncomfortable because people were, we're already lined up, and then you got other people who were trying to come behind us against the stores and weave their way past us, and people were getting ticked off. I thought Linda's brother was going to end up getting in a fight because somebody's pushing, and then we had to calm him down. So, but can you imagine here what's going on as the crowds are gathering, pushing, wanting to see what's happening? The reason why they were coming, more than anything, was because they had just heard what he had done a few miles away in Bethany. They were wondering what he was going to do next. That was the driving force. Verse 18, for this cause also the multitude went and met him because they had heard that he had performed this sign. In contrast to that, verse 19, it's almost humorous. The Pharisees, the Jewish religious leaders, who tried to quiet him and do him in. The Pharisees, therefore, said to one another, you see that you're not doing any good. You guys aren't doing any good. What happens when when things go wrong? What do people instinctively often do? When a plan falls apart, you blame somebody. Right? You point the finger. You really screwed this one up, didn't you? You messed this one up big time. Can't you do anything right? You had a job to do. Shut him down, quiet him. Nah, you can't. Can you do anything? And so they're starting to point fingers and blame each other because their plan isn't working too well. The world is going after him. Everybody's showing up. About him, not us anymore, but him. And so you get all this happening. That's the stage setter for what occurs as Jesus arrives into Jerusalem. Here they come. And in the midst of the crowd that's gathered, comes into the city, enters the temple area to worship at the Passover. Out of all of that, John alone gives us this interesting account. Here is the searching question in verse 20. And you can pass by this and miss what is significant. There were certain Greeks. Now, that doesn't literally mean Greeks like we would speak of Greek people who in the New York area own all the diners. We're not talking about that. When the Bible uses the word Greeks, it's talking about those who are non-Jews. They're part of the Gentile culture. These are not Jews who were there at the temple to worship at the Passover. There were certain Greeks among them who were going up to worship at the feast. It was commonplace that you would have many non-Jews, Gentiles from the Greek Roman world, who had been so impressed with this bizarre monotheistic religion, Judaism. In spite of their paganism and worshiping multitudes of gods, many impressed with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, placing their faith in Abraham's God, and they became worshipers with the Hebrews. They're called proselytes, converts to Judaism. And they would participate in all the sacrifices, bring sacrifices to the Hebrew priests for their family, whether it was Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, or Passover like this. They would come to worship, offer the lamb, and participate in Passover celebrations, admiring the Hebrew culture and identifying themselves spiritually with that same faith. The text seems to suggest from the verb in verse 20 where it says they were going up to worship. Is that what your text says? The verb in verse 20, they were going up. That's pretty exact in the New American Standard, and they nail the verb pretty well. The verb tense implies that they had been doing this for years. They'd been coming to Jerusalem for the Passover year after year after year. It had been their pattern, so probably they had been worshipers of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob for a long time. Maybe even their family ancestors did also. So here they are, celebrating as Gentiles the Passover, as many did last night, celebrating with us. And they're there to worship. They're there with their lambs for the sacrifice. But there's a little bit of a logistical problem that the Gentile worshipers would have. That wouldn't be a problem for the Jews. Anybody know what I'm talking about? What am I talking about? What logistical problem would they have? You can't get into the inner temple area because the Gentiles were, by design, kept outside. There was the wall of separation. That, by the way, Jesus came to break down. That's what Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 2. He broke down the middle wall of partition, the separation between Jews and non-Jews. When we come by faith to Jesus, who loved us and gave himself for us, we enter into that relationship with God, and there is no distinction, there is no separation. We are one family. But in that culture, there was a wall, and outside that wall was the courtyard where the Gentiles could gather. They couldn't go on the inside. Now, the Jews, to get to the inner court, would have to go through the court of the Gentiles and through an entrance gate, through the wall, to the other side where the lambs would be presented to the priests for sacrifice and worship would go on. But no Gentile was allowed inside. So there they are on the outside. In order for them to present their lambs for the Passover, they would have to rely on a neighbor or someone that they knew as a Jew who would take their lamb. Would you please deliver this to the priest on our behalf for sacrifice? And they would have to bring their sacrificial lamb inside that inside the courtyard to be brought to the priest. So the Gentiles gather on the outside. Clear sense of separation, right? Here they are. Apparently in the scene, as they're gathering together for worship, in verse 21, these therefore came to Philip. Well, that gives me some insight. I know Philip is one of the called 12 of Jesus. Philip came, we're told, John highlights this in verse 21, from Bethsaida, which is up north in Galilee. That was an area that had a significant Gentile population. The name Philip that he's identified with is a Greek name, would suggest that he probably came from up in that area as well. It is possible that these Gentile worshipers at the Passover knew Philip. Maybe they even came from the same region. But they recognized Philip as being one of the disciples of Jesus. So they stopped him. Probably Philip is making his way through the court of the Gentiles into the inner court where the Jews would gather for worship. And these Gentiles saw Philip, maybe recognized him, and they're stopping him. Hey, we know him. So they go out of their way to get Philip's attention. And the word spoken to Philip was rather simple. They began to ask him, saying, "Sir, respect. You know him. We know you know him. We desperately desire just a few moments of his time. Please. We can't go there. We know he's there. But you're going there. And we know that you're going to see him. Please, we beg you. We really desire to speak with Jesus, please." Wow. It took an extraordinary amount of courage for non-Jews to make that kind of a request. Sensing a searching, passionate heart to connect up with Jesus. What were they thinking? What was their belief system? What was the sense is that they're thinking far more than just a cool miracle worker who just raised somebody from the dead. There's something greater than this here. It wouldn't be highlighted. And from what we'll see in a moment of Jesus' response, he may well be answering some of the questions that they would have been asking. We really would like to be able to talk to him. I know it's way, way out there. It's an insane request. I mean, he's in there where he belongs, and you're going to be in there, and we're Gentiles, and we kind of get. Please, any chance, please. For Philip to hear that kind of a question, my sense would be he would have really been stumped and dumbfounded to know what to do. Because for 3 years, the whole issue of Gentiles was one that was foggy for the disciples. When Jesus began his public ministry with the disciples, the attitude was, at first, it's all about speaking to the Jews. And in fact, there were some clear statements Jesus made at the beginning that said, we're going to have nothing to do with the Gentiles at first. Remember, maybe these words are in Matthew chapter 10, verses 5 and 6, as he calls the disciples to send them out to minister, way back at the beginning of the 3-year period. Jesus said to the disciples in Matthew 10, verses 5 and 6, "Do not go by way of the Gentiles." Don't talk to them. We're following your tradition. You'll have nothing to do with them. You will not speak to them. You will not minister to them. We are exclusively focused on the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Jews. That's it. That was the culture. And it must have gotten confusing as Jesus taught that. And then you have these interesting occasions during his public ministry where he seemed to run against the grain of what he had initially said. Like early on, remember what he did with the disciples in John chapter 4 when Jesus went where? Who did he connect with in John 4? Bible scholars, we've been here. The woman at the well, Samaria. Remember how flipped out the disciples were? What are we doing here? These half-breeds who hated us and we hate them? Mutual non-admiration society? What are we doing here with her? A Gentile with her lifestyle? Yuck! What's he doing? He talked about not going way of the Gentiles, and then he does that. That didn't make any sense. Or maybe this interesting miracle recorded in Matthew chapter 15. Just a couple of verses. Turn there with me quickly. Matthew chapter 15. With this mindset, this would have raised some eyebrows also. Matthew chapter 15 and verse 22. Jesus went to a Gentile region in verse 21. What's he doing going there? I thought it was only to the Jews. And in verse 22, a Canaanite woman who came from the culture of the Canaanites, who historically were generations before as vile and godless and immoral and filthy and horrific as any culture you could find. This woman, a descendant, Gentile, from the Canaanites, comes out crying out to Jesus in verse 22, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David," acknowledging him as the Jewish Messiah. "My daughter is cruelly demon-possessed." Coming from her culture, I'm sure that was true. Verse 23, he did not answer her a word. Following the script. They ain't talking to Gentiles. Nothing to do with them. He ignored her. She's crying out. His disciples came to him and kept asking him, saying, "Send her away. She's sick. She's nuts. She's got a couple of screws loose. A couple of French fries short of a Happy Meal. She is really off there. Get her out of here. She is disturbing what you're going to do. She's a Gentile. She's a loser. She's garbage. Get rid of her." That's their mindset, right? He answered and said, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Just echoing what they're thinking. She came and began to bow before him. "Help me, please, I'm begging you." She wouldn't quit. He answered and said, "It's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." He's echoing the mindset of the disciples. She said, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs feed on the crumbs which fall from their master's table." She's not arguing. Wow. Then Jesus answered and said to her, "Woman, your faith is great. Be it done to you as you wish." And her daughter was healed at once. He is going to incrementally shatter the prejudice, the mindset that was so ingrained in the Hebrew culture for why he really came. He came unto his own, but his own received him not. Gradually, as the Hebrews rejected him more and more, he began to open himself up to the non-Jewish peoples. It's in Matthew chapter 11 when Jesus said, "Come unto me all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." That was his first invitation, Matthew 11:28, to not only Jews, but to Gentiles also. The word "all" is most important. I'm coming not just for you. Remember what Jesus taught at the end in John chapter 10 and verse 16. It's worth looking at. John chapter 10. This is moving now toward this Last Supper and his entrance. Look at the change that's occurring. John chapter 10. Go back to verse 14. "I am the good shepherd. I know my own know me." Verse 15 of John 10. "Even as the Father knows me and I know the Father, I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep who are not of this fold. I must bring them also. They shall hear my voice. They shall become one flock with one shepherd." What's he talking about? Not like the Mormons who are talking about, Utah. Give me a break. Polluting truth. It is what it is. When Jesus said, "I have other sheep not as his fold," he's saying, not to Jews. I came for the whole world. God so loved the world, not just the Hebrews. And Getting it through the skull of his people was incremental and took time. That's the framework of Gentiles coming to Philip saying, we want to see Jesus. And Philip doesn't know what to do with this. I have no clue where to go with this one. Philip isn't one of the inside disciples. Peter, James, and John were the ones who spent the most time with Jesus. Andrew's kind of a bridge to those guys. So Philip says, let me see what I can do. And, he disappears, goes in beyond the wall to the inner court, and he sees Andrew, one of the other disciples. Go back to John chapter 12, verse 22. Philip told Andrew. Andrew says, I don't know what to do with this one. Gentiles want to, I don't think he's going to be too happy with that. Come on, we'll walk over. So they go and they tell Jesus. Whoa. Hey, I know you may not want to handle this, but there are some of these Gentiles out there in the outer court. They're begging us to talk to you. They're losers. They're no good. We got busy stuff to do. It's Passover. One would suspect that Jesus probably took all of his disciples with him and began to make his way with them back out of the inner court into the outer court of the Gentiles. It's the only thing that would make sense. Talking as he went, till there with the disciples and this group of seekers, he begins to respond to their seeking heart. It's in that context that he speaks in verse 24 of the reason why he came. It is Jesus' invitation to Jews who were there at the Passover as well as the Gentiles who were there also. It's in that context, these familiar words that we have looked at before. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains by itself, but if it dies, it bears much fruit. He's identifying for his disciples as well as for these Gentile seekers, knowing their hearts, why he came. I didn't come to be a king and overthrow Rome. Nobody's getting it yet. They will. I didn't come for that purpose. I came to do what happens when you plant this time of year, the seed into the ground. That seed that will be placed into the ground and will rot and die, and out of that death there will be new life formed that will emerge. I came to be the grain of wheat. I came to be the Passover lamb. I've told you this over and over and over again, not getting it over your head, just no clue. You're not going to get it now. You'll get it in a few weeks. It'll all come together. But that's what I came for. I came to be the grain of wheat. I came to give my life for you. I came to take upon myself all of your guilt and sin that separates you from the Father, as well as even these Gentile seekers. Their sin also. I came for the whole world of people. I came to die and be buried. He announces his own atoning work in a brief parable. And then announcing his own substitutionary death, Passover lamb, dying for our sin, he gives an invitation to his audience, not just to his disciples, but even to these Gentiles. And the invitation is uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. He doesn't suggest, it'd be nice if you kind of believe this and maybe you'll have some interesting life change. It doesn't call for that at all. Verse 25, if you understand that that's why I've come, then here's the only response that is valid. If you love your life, if you care about your life, you're going to have to lose it. Meaning you're going to have to give it up. We've talked about this a number of times. It's the most frequently taught sermon of Jesus, found anywhere in the Gospels. He always defined faith and following in the strictest of terms. It isn't casual. It isn't, he's cool. Sunday, church time. I'm a Jesus guy. Monday, it's all about me. What I'm doing, I am dying for you. I am sacrificing my life for you. I am taking all of your guilt, all of your sin upon me so that I can set you free. You're going to believe that? That's going to mean if I'm giving my life up for you, that's what I'm expecting you're going to do in response. You're going to say, God, you love me that much. I give my life away to you. That's his call. You love life? Lose it. You're going to say, this life, for all I'm accumulating for me, it isn't worth a lick in the end. Gets me nowhere. That self-centered pursuit, I hate it. And by giving it up to you, what do I get in return? End of verse 25. What I could never earn on my own, life eternal. Transformation. There's the call. That's faith defined by Jesus. If anyone serves me, verse 26, let him follow me, that where I am, there shall my servant be also. Deny your cross, pick up your cross, deny yourself, follow me. He's calling to that kind of surrender, to the disciples as well as to Gentile seekers. Here's Jesus coming at the Passover. Here's his invitation. I'm intrigued at in ending here, the invitation he gives at the tail of this. Go later to verse 44, John 12:44. Here's the end of his sermon and his invitation. See it in verse 44, John 12? Jesus cried out, so it wasn't soft. Very passionate, very emotional. He who believes in me does not believe in me, but in him who sent me. And he who beholds me, beholds the one who sent me. I have come as light into the world, that everyone who believes in me may not remain in darkness. He is calling them to repent, to turn from their sin, to place their faith in him, and allow God to do the transformation from within, bringing God's light, overwhelming that sin and darkness. There's his invitation. And the responses to this sermon are rather fascinating. They're kind of spread all through here. Verse 37, you get some responses. John 12:37, though we had performed so many signs before them, yet they were not believing. Prince of Preachers, seminal moment. Just before the cross, even then, many just not believing. It's true today. Just not getting it. And then you get verse 42. Many even of the rulers believed in him. Because of the Pharisees, they were not confessing him lest they should be put out of the synagogue. So that's an interesting statement that John includes, isn't it? While the masses, many, no clue, there were some quietly of the core of the religious leaders who hated Jesus. There were some who were absolutely being convinced that he's the Messiah. Quietly renouncing him. But not publicly yet. Nicodemus, probably one of them. Joseph of Arimathea, who will come public. They'll go public. They're among them, but others as well. 3 years, over and over again, it was starting to get through. It's like what we told you about before, what's going on in Brooklyn very quietly among the Hasidic community. There are some very, very ultra-Orthodox rabbis who are very few, but are coming to believe in Yeshua, Jesus, as their Messiah and Savior. So some of that's going on as well. And yeah, then there are these Greeks. Don't know. My sense is, based upon Jesus' teaching, my guess is he probably preached to their searching heart. If he had a private audience with them, my guess is that that's what they'd be asking. We are just blown away by who you are. It's more than just the miracles. We know you're here for a bigger reason. We really want to understand who you are. And Jesus said to them, I'm the one who's come to be the grain of wheat. I've come to die for your sin. The Father loves you. They may reject you because of who you are. They may have a wall that separates you. The Father doesn't. You believe me, there are no walls of separation. You'll enter into a relationship with me. I'll transform you from the inside out. You'll be a new creature, an eternal home, and a new family. No walls, no outer court. What's our response to the Jesus who came for us? Let's pray. Father, give us eyes to see, ears to hear, hearts to respond to the message of Jesus. While many, it was same old. For seekers like this, perhaps permanently transforming. Lord God, may you speak to our hearts where we are. May we see the truth of who Jesus is that so few have seen. May we find by faith in him new life, absolute forgiveness, unconditional love, grace that is undeserved, and mercy that rescues us from all of our sin and guilt. We worship you as our King and our Redeemer. In Jesus' name, amen.